Welcome everyone to the virtual programming with Delaware Libraries. I'm Dorcia at Bear Library. I'm one of the program coordinators, and Will Hahn has graciously agreed to come and do another one of his series, and this one is entitled Writing a Series and How to Keep That Series Going. He is the chronicler, I can't even say it today, of Lands of Hope, which is one of his great fantasy series. So take it away, Will.
Thanks very much, Dorcia. Thanks everyone for coming today. If you're attending live, there'll be a chance for questions and answers later. And if you happen to see this on the YouTube channel later on, you can send me an email with questions that you may have. I am Will Hahn. I am the chronicler of the Lands of Hope. I make this little distinction between chronicling and writing, but don't worry about it today, because writing a series is the same no matter what. And today, the topic, as we've said, is any which way but done, writing a series for fun and world domination, I suppose. That's always the goal. Let me get the screen away from my face and onto the presentation as quickly as I can. I trust everyone can see the big screen with that title on it. Let's get started. As I say, there'll be time for questions later, and I hope you enjoy. A little bit on me. I am an epic fantasy writer, so it's appropriate that I had mortal challenges from the very beginning of my life, including having 5 sisters, being born in the Vermont winter. These are lethal challenges which I was able to survive, and they forged me into a writer who understood about desperate chances, quests against the odds. And I'm a guy who's been looking at the same world for an unthinkably long period of time. It's too long a story to go into now, as most epic fantasy stories are. But the point is, around 12 years ago, I got into setting words down on paper in a narrative form, and I've been very happy with doing that ever since. That was the age of the original sort of self-publishing wave. The Kindle was coming along. People thought paper was dead. We were perhaps a little over-optimistic about that, which is fine. But it was the early days, and a lot was going on. I cut my teeth with some great helpers, and have had a lot of good experiences in writing. And today, when I think back on the other talks that I've given here for the library, it's been great to have the Bear Library's support for this seminar series. I realize that some of the things that's always the same about the talks I'm giving are things about writing that you sort of forget because you were busy writing. We get into the mode, I speak particularly to the aspiring author, someone who is perhaps drafting right now, just starting out, or maybe you have 1 book out or 2, but it's still a pretty much a new experience to you, and you're really facing that large, enormous challenge. It's not to be underestimated, an enormous challenge in getting a book all the way from an idea in your head out to paper, polished, published, and then even begin to think about marketing yourself. That really absorbs a tremendous amount of attention. And other talks that I've given in the series are about things that you might innocently forget about on your way to the big focus, the big opus that you're trying to get through. Was it important to have a good first line, for example? Was it important to have a good cover on your book? Have you thought about maybe going into audiobooks? These are all things that I've talked about in the past as well. And today I think is one of the, again, most obvious, but potentially most exciting ideas that you may have forgotten about your writing because you were busy writing. And that is the idea of having a series out of the work that you're doing. Because writing tends to feel like this all-consuming one-off story. You've got a story to write. And for you, oftentimes it's the story. You're totally invested. And you get to the point where you've established a routine, and thank goodness you found a good time to write and the way to focus your own thoughts. You've mastered your schedule, and you're starting to really produce material. Or maybe you have a book done. You've written the magic words at the end, and then you sort of lift up out of that and come to what feels to you like a completely different process. Now we're going to go do another book. And we tend to think of these books as whole and complete, hopefully classics. I'm not making fun of the effort here. A lot of the greatest books in the world, of course, are these one-off classics. Moby Dick, Christmas Carol, personal favorite, and they don't go anywhere else. The ideas come to you out of whole cloth in a way. This is the image that I have over here on the right, the image of the birth of Athena. If you don't know the Greek myth, those Greeks were really pretty wacky people. Zeus swallows one of his lovers and she goes up into his brain. She's in the form of a fly. I don't know why this is happening, but she gives birth to Athena inside Zeus's brain, and he has these splitting migraine headaches. And I mean splitting, because he goes to Hephaestus, the forger, and says, "Can you help me?" And Hephaestus takes the hammer and chisel and opens up Zeus's brain, and ta-da, there's Athena, full grown, the goddess of wisdom, ready to take her place right from day one. And I think our stories tend to come off that way, which is fine. You're in the creative process. You are trying to get that story done. That's entirely understandable. But we think of going to another story not necessarily connected to that a lot of times. When you're finished with your first book, you go, oh, that's done. Now what? And yet all around us, as we are writing and as we were loving reading earlier in our lives, there's nothing but series, it seems like, everywhere. We look at The Hunger Games, this great dystopian young adult series made into movies. We all dream of that, let's be honest. Twilight series, paranormal romance, made into movies. We love that. That's the end goal. We want the book we're working on now to be made into a movie. We can even see which actors we want to play the major roles. We know that. Yeah, but these were series books. How did that happen? And of course, the series of unfortunate events by Lemony Snicket. What? I can't even define what that is. It's mystery. It's peril. It's comedy. It's a little dystopian. It's very satirical. It's fantastic, and it's 13 books, of course. If you haven't read it, it's really fantastic. It's incredibly engaging writing, and they made a movie. And of course, going all the way back, this is nothing new. Sherlock Holmes was Arthur Conan Doyle's go-to character over the course of 40 years. He wrote something like 22 or more novels and novellas about Sherlock Holmes, a character who even survived death, actually. So we're writing to a tale, but all around us are examples, and many of them are ones that you probably know and liked, that were crafted as series. And when you think about it, gee, why not be thinking in terms of writing a series? There's so many good reasons to take your work and gain all the advantages of the hard work that you're doing. And I just want to quickly run down these. I would think you'd be able to think of these yourself, right? But the first one might be a little surprising, depending on where you are in the publishing process. You may get feedback from readers looking at a character that you thought was just a one-off, a throwaway, a cameo role, but they come to you and go, wow, I loved that guy. I wonder what happens to him next. And you're like, next? You haven't given a single thought to it, but the readers actually respond to that. That's happened to me a couple of times with narrators for a single chapter that I thought were just going to be there for the one chapter, but readers really liked the character. And so I was forced to come back and think about, maybe I could expand their story a little bit more. Sometimes you've got a lot of notes, you've got scraps of scenes, you've got ideas that you've jotted down depending on your writing style that you've never really drawn together. You've never really picked them back up again. And maybe there are similarities between those loose ends that you have. Alternately, you might have taken the draft of your book to beta readers, or if you have a traditional publishing contract, you go to an editor, and what do they always say? Oh, it's great. Lose 20,000 words and you'll be fine. Lose 10,000 words and it'll be great. And you find yourself having to cut out maybe an entire setting or a whole subplot. And there it is, lying on the cutting room floor, but it's good. It's good material. You didn't cut it because it was bad. You cut it because somebody ordered you to cut it. Well, there's potential there, right? Because you've done the work of building your world already, whether it's a historical romance book or a police procedural or a wacky sci-fi. You've built a world, and when you have loose ends like that, or characters that tend to march on even beyond your own intent, The work's already done. You haven't got to keep reinventing the wheel all the time. You can just keep playing in this world, and the work you did comes back and pays back to you, right? Now, I'm not objective about that. I'm an epic fantasy author. I write to what's called the legendarium, like a Tolkien or a Lewis. I have this one big world, and I write stories that are always set in that world. So the calendar is done. The way magic happens, where the bad guys are, what kind of monsters you meet, all of that stuff is well prepared for me, right? And I save a lot of energy because I'm always playing in the same playroom. And that can be a tremendous asset to you as well when you think about little scraps and pieces of your writing that maybe got dropped from your manuscript, but they're not bad. I always say, don't delete, just cut and move, and you never know what might happen. And then, of course, the power, the incredible publishing power of a series. Readers love to see things in series because when they like your book, they want to read more of what you've got. It's a very powerful marketing tool for you. It's great on Amazon. If you have books, in 6 or 8 or 10 in a series, you can start to bundle them together, and readers really like that. They like getting the bundled collection of the first 3 or the first 5. You make up your mind what you want to do. A lot of series writers today, looking at ebooks, give the first one away. The first one might be a little shorter, kind of an introductory little novella, and they give it away, or they sell it maybe just for 99 cents, and then link to the other books in the series for you, so to kind of hook you on the idea of coming back for the whole series. And publishers and agents like that, if anything, you're looking for traditional publication today, I'm not the expert, but everybody understands they're even more conservative than they ever were. They really want to know that they can get some mileage out of you before they take a chance on a new author under any circumstances. I don't think your odds are great under any circumstances, but if you show them that you're working on a series, that you've got ideas put together and you're working on maybe the first book of that series, that can be a marketing tool that impresses people. And if you go off and do it on your own, then you're really golden. By the way, as powerful as book bundles are for ebooks and paperbacks, audio books, they're like flypaper to have a bundle, because the way Audible works through credits, you can spend as a subscriber the same credit to get a 3 or a 4 book bundle that you would to get each of those books separately. So it's a real win-win, because Audible compensates the author and the narrator at a little bit higher rate when they buy the bundle, and you as a subscriber just use the same credit that you would have used for any one of the books individually, and now you've really got them hooked because they're listening to all 3 and they can't wait for number 4. And by the way, didn't you like reading series when you were younger, or maybe still? I mean, look what I have here, the Robert Jordan Wheel of Time books. I think there's 16 or 15 in the whole series. Edgar Rice Burroughs with John Carter, the Warlord of Mars, a personal favorite of mine. He wrote 11 novels about John Carter and the world of Barsoom over the course of 22 years. He kept coming back to it, 750,000 words about this one character in this one setting on the dying planet of Mars. Back in the day of Edgar Rice Burroughs, when we didn't have space travel and people were still looking at, the canals. They thought they were canals on Mars. He just said, oh yeah, those were real canals. And he ran with it. And that's in between, by the way, the other 69 books he wrote over the course of his career. So you can come back to the series. You don't have to just stay with it. You can go away and come back. And it can be, like it was for some of these pulp authors, a real breadwinner for you. So everywhere you look, I think there's really excellent reasons to think about doing a series, to working in a series. On the other hand, it can be anxiety producing. Here is Will Hahn in one of his anxious moments. As you can see, something about series writing does tend to push us away. Even though there's all these good reasons, even though we love the series, we tend oftentimes not to think of our work as really being series worthy or series appropriate. And that could be right. It could be that what you are working on right now is a classic. That's not necessarily the wrong instinct, but just take a moment and think about it. Are you shying away from thinking about a series because it seems to you like it's such a massive undertaking? Just writing the one book is so much work, and now you're asking me to think about 5 or 6 or who knows how many in a row. It's like an enormous forest of obstacle to you. And like I said, we tend to think of the writing as a one-off. It all springs into being full grown like Athena right out of your mind, complete with the headache, by the way. That's another aspect of this that's very similar, that it gives you a headache, these characters. But we don't tend to think about the childhood of those characters sometimes. We don't tend to think about anything that happens to them after we write the end, at the end of that first book. So maybe series intimidate us because we're thinking that we have to write the whole series at once. All the books of the Lightning Thief series at once, all the Sherlock Holmes at once. That's not what any of these authors did. They wrote a book at a time, just like you're doing now. And not all of them decided what it was going to be like at the end when they started the first one. Some did, because there are different kinds of series, which I'll talk about in a second. And we also feel intimidated by how well these other guys did. Oh, I can never be as concise and clear as Edgar Rice Burroughs. I could never horrify people the way H.P. Lovecraft did. I could never be please, you have to face that, right? You have to look in the mirror and face that. You're writing a book. It's not in the end competitive. You're looking for your voice, and you don't want to ignore the potential of the story that's coming to you, which could very well be a series potential. We also sometimes think that we have to get this whole thing done right now. I can't write a series because I can't finish it all this year, which is ridiculous. As I said, these authors wrote over the course of many years. J.K. Rowling and George Martin. George Martin's not done, right? The Game of Thrones, he may never write that last book, but he made a few $100 million off the first 6. I think, he's probably okay with that, right? So you don't talk yourself into these myths about what series writing has to be. Just, count to 10. Recite the elvish meme of patience, as the elves in my world do. They recite the meme of patience when the humans urge them to go too fast. Just deep breath. Nothing about writing a series takes the control of the story away from you. You get to make all the decisions. Of course you do. And you may decide that the thing you're working on now is not series worthy. It's not appropriate for a series. But take a look. It might be. And you wouldn't want to overlook that potential. You can't write all series at once. And you can't write the whole series at once. My goal today is to introduce you to 3 different kinds of series. I think they're big, general types. You probably have thought of them before. Just to give you a way of thinking about how series can be different, how you don't have to tackle the whole canon of every series you ever wrote in one go, but you could make a distinction between different kinds of series, and one or more of them might be appropriate to some ideas you're actually having. Hopefully, I can give you a yardstick to distinguish between different kinds of series and decide whether the work you're doing is appropriate for you. So the first kind of series, the status quo series, or I sometimes think it's referred to pretty often as episodic, series that are episodic. The examples I use on TV, the old sitcom Gilligan's Island, I think most of you may be familiar with that, a 3-hour tour, and these 7 people get wrecked on an island and they can never get off. Every episode is a half hour of total slapstick whackball comedy, and every episode is about a way to possibly get off the island, and every episode Gilligan screws it up and they end up staying there on the island, right? A classic episodic series. And in terms of books, almost any of the great murder mysteries, I pick Hercule Poirot or others, the same thing, right? Here comes the great detective. In the beginning of the book, you see that a terrible crime has happened, usually a murder, maybe a great theft, and there just doesn't seem to be any way that anyone could figure out what happened. But here comes the detective, and while Watson sees it, he never gets it, right? But for Holmes, it's elementary, my dear. And on he goes to pick apart all the little threads, or Poirot or Miss Marple, all of them, to figure out in the end that, yes, it was he who did it, or she who did it. And off they go to the hoosegow. So episodic series are what I call status quo series, because in every important way, they end up back where they started, right? They don't really move off the center point. Mysteries, like murder mysteries, paranormal stories, and a lot of comedy plots can be very good as status quo series. What is the emphasis in a status quo series? Plot. Something about the way the situation is set up is just amusing or eternally attractive. It always engages your attention. With Gilligan's Island, it's comedy. With Hercule Poirot, it's the mystery. It's kind of the macabre sometimes, or the depths of human depravity. You know, we examine that. But again, the characters don't really go anywhere. I don't know if you've heard the common legend. I haven't been able to figure out if the writers actually were thinking this way, but on Gilligan's Island, there's a common legend that each of these characters stands for one of the 7 deadly vices, right? The skipper, going left to right, the skipper is anger. Gilligan is sloth. Ginger, of course, is lust. Mr. Thurston Howell is, of course, greed. His wife is gluttony, because she's so, everything has to be just so, right? It's gluttony. Marianne is envy, and the professor is pride, right? And so they really don't have what it takes to get off the island. They all have vices, right? But the same things are going to happen no matter whether it's the episode about the guy who looks just like Thurston Howell getting wrecked on the island too, or the one where the robot comes up out of the sea and gives them a chance to get a message out. Whatever the situation, however wacky it is, the skipper is going to take his hat off and hit Gilligan over the head as hard as he can at some point. Marianne is probably going to try to be helpful in some way, and it won't quite work out. Ginger will try to come on to Gilligan to get him to do some favor for her, and he'll turn his head fast and knock himself out against a tree. These things, all of these little gags happen in almost all the episodes. And of course, before the end, Gilligan manages to screw it up, and they end up still stuck on the island. Is it important to read episodic series in the order that they were written? No, absolutely not, because the story doesn't really go anywhere. I don't mean to have that sound as bad as it does, but you can be perfectly comfortable with a Agatha Christie mystery. You can pick up number 2, then you can read number 17, then you can go back to number 1. It really doesn't matter. Even in Sherlock Holmes, Watson eventually gets married, and then a few episodes later, Sherlock Holmes dies. He falls off the falls with Moriarty. But people complained. The readers complained. They wanted Sherlock Holmes. So he's back. That's all. Just he comes back. I didn't really die. And the game is afoot. And right back to where they were. So it was all a dream. Remember that one from Dallas? It was all a dream, right? So you could just restart the situation whenever you want. It's very comfortable. And again, you're taking advantage of the same setting, the same background and characters. It can be a very efficient way of cranking out a bunch of amusing and interesting stories. The question I think that we have for the status quo series is whether this is so yesterday or not. And I'm not sure I can answer that question for you. There definitely are series like this. And I think there are still series like this. I don't know if they are serious series. When I try to think of current day examples, the first thing that came to my mind was Big Bang Theory, right? It doesn't really matter which episode I'm watching. I know how Ravi and everybody, all the other characters are going to interact. I know that they're not going to really make any big changes in the world, no matter what their ambitions are. It's a comedy. But are there dramas? Are there tragedies that fit this model? I'm not so sure. And again, I'm not sure I can be the right person to judge this, because my generation, we grew up being exposed to these classic sitcoms like Gilligan's Island, Beverly Hillbillies, and shows like that. We read the comic books, the golden age of comic books in the 60s and early 70s, where they were just episodic. You pick up any Iron Man and he's facing some crook, and you see how he does. It doesn't really matter the order. You're just looking at the plot of it, the plot point, right? A man must wear a suit of armor to keep himself alive, and so he decides to be a superhero. Great. But I do think it's definitely one kind of series that you could bounce your ideas off of and think about whether it's right for you. But when we talk about episodic series that don't really move the plot, that naturally leads to a consideration of a second kind of series, the sneaky epic, what I call the sneaky epic, a character arc in disguise. My examples here: Once Upon a Time on AMC, ABC, The Walking Dead on AMC, And of course, Game of Thrones from my home genre, epic or heroic fantasy. In this case, it's not just that epic fantasy owns it, but the nature of epicness is what the character arc series is about. Fantasy is a home of this kind of epic quality where there's a big stake in the plot, where things really do move forward, where events happen and occur and life changes for the characters. Everything really the opposite of what we were just talking about. But other series can have, other genres, I should say, can have epic qualities to them. Literary fiction can march ahead in that kind of epic fashion. A book like Atlas Shrugged, for example, is epic. It concerns such big things. So the entire country and where it's all going and all these characters. It's in many ways very similar in its formula to a big Lord of the Rings style fantasy book. So any genre that takes on those kind of stakes and scope and the degree of change when the world is at stake, it's an epic type of book. I do think fantasy was the home of it, but other genres can share that. And the emphasis here, as opposed to what we talked about before, is on character. You have to get down close to the people who are bringing the story to your reader, and you've got to make them care about what's happening to them, what they feel and think about what's happening, how they change as the events change. Somebody like, if you know Lord of the Rings, somebody like Boromir, who is so proud and arrogant to start with, but very late, at the very end, right? He learns his lesson and he defends the hobbits. And I get so choked up. Whenever I see it in the movie, I cry. Whenever I see that, you know, he's dying and he swears his loyalty to Aragorn, he redeems himself, right? At the very end. And he's the man. He's the one who's like us, right? So there is some hope for us. That kind of a character arc, he doesn't make it to the end of the story, but those kinds of very meaningful events, no going back, the time is marching forward. That's what really qualifies this kind of series. And I think it puts an obligation on you to have some kind of an idea of what's going to be happening in the course of this series. It probably wouldn't be good to start a sneaky epic series without really deciding where it all ends, roughly how many books there are going to be in the series. You can't just take it on like you would an episodic series. Is it important to read these? Yes, absolutely. Yes, it's a disaster to read sneaky epic series, character arc series out of order. Nothing could be worse, right? It's incredibly important to line the dominoes up in order. Now, the question you'd have to answer is this worth the headache? And here's where I was talking before about this. As the author, you have to make these decisions. Is it a book that just needs to be one enormous book, or should it be split in two? Should it be split in three? Is there a valid reason for finishing a book here, even though the ending isn't arrived at? Is there kind of an ending that needs to come here? And this can happen in the course of your writing venture. My great opus, my trunk novel, was called Judgment's Tale, and I was laboring at it for years. I approached a point where I realized I was coming up on 200,000 words, which I knew was around the size of a good, thick, epic fantasy novel, and I was nowhere near done. There were so many other threads involved in the story, not just Solemn Judgment's, the main character's arc, but so many other things were involved. I began to think, wow, this book will already prop open a fire door. I don't need it to be as thick as, you know, a chop of wood. So then it occurred to me that I was coming up very close on a spot where Solemn Judgment, the main character, did reach a kind of ending. He solved a great problem. He didn't destroy, but he frustrated a great evil, and he kind of saved the situation for people. And he was also banished from the city where he had been staying, because nobody likes Solemn Judgment. They don't get along with him. So his arc had reached a kind of ending. Meanwhile, another group of characters at that same time had made an enormous discovery in the middle of a desperate fight, which was kind of a cliffhanger. So I had two reasons to kind of 1-2 punch and end a book there, and then create a second book which I went on and filled. It was just as long as the first one. I really was just about exactly halfway through the whole story. I was amazed at how big the story became. But you have to make those decisions as the writer. If an editor from a traditional publishing house comes to you, like I said, and tells you, you got to cut 20,000 words, they're not going to tell you which 20,000 to cut. They're not going to tell you whether it's better to cut them or to create a second book. They don't even know which one is better. It's your story. And so a sneaky epic series forces you to face these questions. Not all stories will be appropriate for it, but this is part of what you would have to face if you want this kind. So I think those two are fairly easy to understand. They're kind of opposites of each other in many ways. But there is a third kind that I want to talk about today. There's actually a lot more than three, I'm sure. Plus, there are all kinds of variations between these series that can be sort of episodic, but move a little bit toward the end. All those things can happen, all those flavors. But let's consider yet a third kind, which I think is the most far out and maybe the most difficult to define. I call it the Just the Kitchen Sink series. Not everything but the kitchen sink, just the kitchen sink. The series that could differ in almost every way, every installment of it could differ in almost every way, and yet there's this one underlying something about it, right? The classic example here are TV Hallmark Christmas movies. If you're not a fan, I apologize, but there can be no better example of what I'm talking about than the Hallmark Christmas movies. My lovely wife sleeps like the hunted wolf. She gets terrible, terrible sleep. She's waking up in the middle of the night all the time. And what she'll do is pop on the TV and look for the Hallmark Christmas movie, because they're on all the time. Christmas in July, Christmas in June, Christmas every month of the year. There's a few of these Christmas movies. And she goes to that, whatever point in the movie it is, she goes to it. And she loves it because they are kind of well written and they are pleasing. And each one of them sounds a little bell, like a kind of a ding about something about Christmas, something about, love, finding love at Christmas. There's this kind of underlying thing, and you don't really even need to know the specifics at all. So these are series where everything can change. Everything. A Regency romance also. You can go from 17th century France to 18th century Europe to England, and then 19th century America. And of course, the place names change, the situations change, but maybe the name of the main character, maybe the woman, she has the same first name. She's always Daphne or something, right? And there's this strata to all of them that tends to bind them together. You can just tell they're written by the same people. Romance is definitely a major factor for Just the Kitchen Sink series, but certain police procedural novels, especially if the emphasis is on the law, like always obeying the law, as opposed to the character of a given detective. And I think a lot of literary authors, when they've written 5 or 6 books that, again, jump all over the country or all over the world, different characters, different places, but they have their tribe that's following them and buying all those books. It's because they sense this essence to the writing that will constantly draw them to it. It may be kind of hard to define, but they can tell what it is and they go for it. I think fairy tales also have this kind of underlying quality for all the differences between them. And so their cousins, the fractured fairy tales, also share that kind of element. And what is that element? I call it theme. So 3 things: plot, character, theme. I blogged about this, and there's a link to it on my website. This is the one that's really the hardest to understand. Plot, I think, is rather easy to understand, and I think most authors do it well. First this happened, then this happened, finally this happened. I think everybody gets that right. Character can be harder, really portraying the main characters, the protagonists, in a way that people connect with and feel for. That can be a little harder, but again, I think most writers get that right. But theme, as near as I can tell, theme, it is over my head, I must tell you, but I am starting to sense that books I have written, unbeknownst to me, did have themes. They did have themes. And some of my colleagues argue that we as writers don't really control the theme. It's the readers. It's in the eye of the beholder, but it's that part of the writing that makes everything mean two things at once. So the character is talking and having an argument, but underlying that is a sense of irony or humor or karma because of what happened before, or what you're lampshading for what's coming up, right? It sort of does double duty all the time. Even a description or even a battle scene can have that underlying meaning that, again, pulls it all together. In a Hallmark movie, it's something like Love Conquers All, or the Regency romance. Love conquers all. That's it. Doesn't matter what country you're in, what century it is, whether she's rich or he's rich. These things, all the differences are just completely vaulted by the power of true love. And it can get a little snarky at times. That you see the Hallmark Christmas bingo card down there. All of these things that will happen in each, they're very likely to happen in each movie. Washed up old actor or actress is in it. First kiss in the last scene, bingo, right? That's going to happen, I think, in 8 out of 10. That should almost be a free space, that they have their first kiss in the last scene of the movie. All of these little things that people can pick out that will happen. They just will happen in the movie, and they all speak to that little theme. They're elements of plot or possibly of character, but they share so much in common because of that theme. I couldn't find the top 10 list. There's a top 10 list of how to tell you're in a Hallmark movie. And one of the entries on the list is the crazy old man on the street corner really is Santa Claus, and you do see that in a lot of these movies as well. So that underlying theme is what pulls these series together. And the litmus test is, never mind what book, never mind what movie or what order you read them in, can you come in halfway through and still be fine? With these movies, the answer is yes. Just like My Lovely Wife. She doesn't need to know how it started. She knows a lot about how it started. It's really just that similar, and she really enjoys it. It gives her a great sense of peace and satisfaction because she knows where it's headed. She doesn't mind seeing another example of it, and it helps her get back to sleep, And that's something that I think you as the author have to brace yourself with. Go look in the mirror and say, look, am I comfortable writing to that? Because I'm here to tell you there is a tribe for this. There are people who will respond to this, and they absolutely love it. Of course, they want to see it or read it from the beginning. But the true test of how it is a series is that despite all the outward signs, all the outward decor, you might say, changing, they can still sense that underlying element, that theme inside there. I like to use the image of a Christmas tree. You go to somebody else's house in late November, early December, and you walk in, and yeah, an evergreen in the living room, that's kind of a clue. But the point is, you instantly recognize that as a Christmas tree, despite the fact that none of the decoration on the outside is the same as yours. The lights are different. The kind of collectible decorations they got are different. Do they use tinsel or not? Is that a star on top? Is it an angel on top? Is it Miss Piggy on top because they love the Muppets? That doesn't matter. You can't be fooled. It's a Christmas tree. And that's the kind of underlying theme, just like the underlying branches of the Christmas tree, that people can recognize immediately. So 3 types of series for you to think about, each of which has, I think, their own special attractions. And something I just want you to consider, that perhaps one of your tales, maybe the one you're thinking about now, the one you're in the middle of drafting now, or maybe one you already wrote, could be eligible to be used in a series of some kind. And I'd like to wrap up by just giving a couple of examples of my own about how this came to me. And the thing I want to emphasize when I talk about my own work is not to openly boast about my own work. I want to cleverly boast about my own work and make you all interested in seeing it. Yes, of course. But the thing I really want to hammer home here is that all of this came to me after I started. There were changes, important changes that went forward. It's not entirely under your control, and it's still okay. The Shards of Light series, I always envisioned as a set of 4 books because I knew that I really had a live one, a good idea that would challenge me and that could possibly be very entertaining for readers. This is heroic fantasy. They've got to save the kingdom. There's a huge conspiracy. And the 3 heroes who can combat this conspiracy, begin the story not aware of each other at all. They've never met. So instead of my typical story where there's a kind of gang of adventurous sorts who are going out to face the problem, these guys have never met each other, and they're very different from each other. Also, the problem that they're facing is a really lethal conspiracy. Even the conspirators aren't fully aware of how wide and how dangerous the thing they're trying to do is. They have actually different goals, and that's part of the plot that has to unfold. And nobody really understands the whole thing. My notion was to have each of the first 3 books focus on one of these 3 heroes. They each get their own book, and then close with a finale. And my initial goal was to have each of those books stand on their own so that you could read kind of an episodic way, that you could read either 1 or 2 or 3 first, and it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter until you got to number 4. As long as you read the first 3 first, you could go in any order. That didn't quite work out. The Captain Justin in the first book, the Stealthic Feldspar in the second book, and then the Priestess Wastara in the third book, they each stood up and had their own little story that came to a good end on their own. But I couldn't quite make them each stand up completely independently because they didn't actually get started at the same time. And especially what the third one, Wastara, does is so important in bringing together the other 2 that I couldn't quite make that second goal come true. But I do think you could start with either 1 or 2 and you'd be fine. By the time you get to number 3, you kind of have to have the first 2 read. And I picked a different voice for each of the characters as well. The Captain Justin in the first book, The Ring and the Flag, is a classic third-person sympathetic. He did this, he thought that, Justin went here. The second book, Feldspar, is more of a detective story. He's a stealthic who takes a lot of risks, and he's a master of disguise. So I put that into the first person. I did this, I saw that. And the third book, I can't believe it, but I did it. It wasn't hard enough. This was by far the hardest book I ever wrote. Perilous Embraces is about an absolutely gorgeous woman who can see the future. And what do I know about either of those 2 things? But on top of that, I threw in second person voice. So you went there, and isn't that just like you to think that? And that was a bit of a challenge, I must say, but I think it came off well. And then in the finale, I'm harvesting all that hard work. I'm in the same setting. The plot has moved forward. It is truly an epic series. It's a character arc series. And in the 4th book, I got a big payoff because now I can start a paragraph or a chapter. And if I use the third person or the second person or the first person voice, you know who you're with automatically, right? I don't even have to waste time with that. You can just dive right in as the action picks up and the characters swirl closer and closer to each other. So I thought that was a successful series. I've really enjoyed it. And again, things had to change as I was crafting it, mainly because of the difficulty in writing book 3. It was really the toughest thing I've ever written. And I think it's good. I think it's really quite good. Another example that I want to use is the Tales of the Tributarians, because this is something that I think shows you just how chaotic the creative process can get. And I want to start out by heartily encouraging all of you to never do any of these things the way I did them, okay? But just sit back and learn from my disgrace, learn from my anguish about how totally chaotic Sierra's writing can be. Long time before I even realized that I was writing a series with the Tales of the Tributarians. When I got energized to start writing back in 2008, it was because I had, I guess I could say, a vision of a great story that I knew people would like and would really react to. And I knew it would be called The Test of Fire. It was my stage 0. I had it all figured out, where it started, where it ended, how it ended. It was all encapsulated in my head, and I had a lot of notes. I knew I could do that. But like a lot of things in epic fantasy, it's kind of sticky. Where does it end? Where does it start? That's a decision you have to make. And as I began my creative process, I realized I wasn't actually writing the Test of Fire story. I was writing a kind of introductory material. In the course of those first few months, I was really quite productive. I furiously put down on paper about 70, 80, 90 pages of introductory material that I ended up calling the prologue to the Test of Fire, because that's what I thought its only purpose was to kind of explain how the characters in the Test of Fire used to be part of a larger group, and they had this great adventure, but then they broke away and came into the setting where the Test of Fire takes place. And this was, we talk about independent publishing. This, I was so excited when I finished this thing. It wasn't even a novella. It was truly a prologue, like an enormous first chapter, the kind that nobody ever reads because it says prologue at the top. And I double-sided printed it, and I took it down to Staples, and I had them copy and cut and put the plastic spiral binder around 6 little copies of it, so that it was like a trade paperback size, black and white. And I handed them out to some of my friends who were kind of familiar with the story. I thought they'd like it, you know. So I was published. I was a published author, and I handled the publication and the distribution and everything. I was very excited. And now I really had the bug to get writing. But instead of turning back to the Test of Fire, I kept thinking, well, yeah, but even this prologue comes from somewhere earlier. These guys had earlier adventures, and I knew that. So I knew that to the left of whatever this thing in the middle was yet another story. And I didn't have very good clarity on it at all, a title or anything. I knew just basically what happened in the days before this prologue happened, getting up to the Test of Fire. So I kind of mentally thought, yeah, there's a tale there, but I'm really not ready for that. So what I ended up doing was turning back around and polishing up this prologue and fleshing it out into a full story of its own. And it's called The Plane of Dreams, in which some of the characters from the Test of Fire appear, and other characters are also there. It's actually a rather big, epic stakes kind of book. So I polished that up, printed it up. That was back in 2011. This is a later cover that came along. And now I finally felt ready to come forward in time and to write the Test of Fire, which came out a couple years ago. Now I had this kind of runway from the Plane of Dreams to move on and write this demi-sequel, where some of the characters from the Plane of Dreams go on and have further adventures in this different setting. So I have literally written a series inside out. I started with 2, I went to 3, and my current challenge is to now go back and write the first book of the series, which I know will be called, the working title is The Sea of Self. With fantasy writing, almost every book is the blank of blank. I don't know if you noticed that, but it happens all the time, the blank of blank. So The Sea of Self will be the first book in this series, and I will start tinkering away on it as soon as I can. I still don't have a perfect understanding of what you might call the theme of that book, but I have all the sequels ready whenever I do get it done. And the nice thing about the Tales of the Tributarians are that they are kind of loosely connected. You can actually pick up the Plane of Dreams, read about a whole story, get a nice satisfying ending. And the same thing with the Test of Fire. So I want to make sure I can do that with the Sea of Self when the time comes. So that was absolutely the most accidental sequence writing that I can ever think of. Please don't do it this way. Please don't try this at home. But it is possible that your ideas that you thought were intended for this totally different area wind up carrying you, if you think about it, into a series of books. And how could that be a bad thing? All right, enough laughing at my foibles. I always like to point to places where you can get help at the end of each talk. And I always start by advising everybody, go to Ann R. Allen's blog, sign up. She pushes out a blog post every Sunday. They're always great. She is a fabulous, supportive, best-selling author. And like a lot of these best-selling authors, she is as nice as the day is long. She's positive. She's polite, just like her main character, Camilla Randall. She will never lose her temper. And she is a terrific person and always comes up with fantastic titles for writer advice on all manner of subjects. In fact, I got started on this series, this idea for this presentation for a series, by writing to Anne and saying, you know, I've looked at your site. I don't see any articles about how to write a series. Did I just miss something? Can you tell me which ones they are? And she wrote back and said, actually, I don't have anything on how to write a series. Would you like to do it? And I said, oh, well, that would be nice. And so you see here, Any Which Way But Done. I got to be a guest blogger on her site. You won't hear anything there that I didn't already tell you today, but it's a great honor to be a guest on Anne's site. And in other areas, there's plenty of other articles about how to write a series. They give steps. They're much more detailed. If you're the kind of writer who is more organized, more of a plotter, I'm more of a pantser myself, but there certainly are a lot of articles out there that will give you much closer to chapter and verse about how to write a series. The only thing I would want to impress upon you is that there are different trees in the forest. There are different flavors of series, and of course, mixtures of those between them that you would want to pay attention to. Another thing I would always recommend for new and aspiring writers, if you're all by yourself doing this, you need people to come and give you critique and support. Those are not opposite things. There are people who can critique your work without being critical or negative. They can point things out, help you catch little flaws or quirks. You need to have somebody who's got your back, a beta group, other writers that you can share drafts with. You can read their drafts and learn from them. There's probably been nothing better for me than to have a fantastic online beta group. They can be in person, they can be online. The Insecure Writers Support Group is somewhat like Ann R. Allen's blog. They do put out articles all the time on writing skill and writing tips and tricks, but they're also a great community of writers, and you may be able to network and hook up with people. Most writers I've found, if they're at a stage where they're starting to publish, they are certainly willing to read one of yours if you're willing to read one of theirs. And you know what? It's just like almost like dating. It might not work out, but an honest effort never goes to waste. And you do need to find such people. If all you have are people who tear down your writing and give you no real constructive criticism, or people who just praise it to the skies and never point out anything wrong, you need to find people who can really have your back and help you notice what's going on with your writing and improve it. And you can do the same for them. Most people are really quite good at spotting quirks, little things, little perhaps inconsistencies or lack of continuity that the writer just doesn't see at all because you're too close to it. And if you're thinking about looking at series that are going on now, maybe for a little inspiration, I would give you my two personal recommendations. I'm not objective about either of these. I love them both, the people as well as the series. The Legionnaire series by Gilbert M. Stack is a fantastic example of shorter books. They're really novellas, 50 or 60,000 words, usually at most. It's about a Roman empire in a world that also has magic. So it's basically pulling the whole Roman political and military structure and dropping it into a world where there are wizards and magic spells and potions. And it's fabulous. The action is great. The characters are great. I'm completely not objective about this. Gilbert Stack is a colleague of mine. We went to school together, and he has asked me to narrate his Legionnaire series. But I want to point out that the prolific output of Mr. Stack in this area is quite worth watching. He has a tremendous arc going, 12 books in this series, and his most recent publication is a prequel to the whole Marcus Venandus, he's the character of the story is Marcus Venandus. He starts him as a tribune, but then he goes back in a prequel to start him out at an even lower rank, the Green Vigil rank, and he's going to have 3 or 4 books in that series, I guess. I don't know how many, plus his regular series, which is already at 12, is on its way to, I think, 18 or 25 books. He's just got this incredibly long arc vision for what's going to happen to Marcus Venandus. A little bit like the Horatio Hornblower series, where every book he sort of rises up in the ranks. He goes from ensign to mate to lieutenant and so forth, and he climbs the ranks in the British Navy in somewhat the same way. Marcus is on a rising path and getting into more and more trouble with every book. Hey, if fantasy isn't your thing, if military action is not your thing, the Camilla Randall mysteries I would recommend to anybody. Get one, read it. Yes, Ann Allen is a friend of mine. Yes, she's a big supporter of mine. I am telling you, they're hilarious, they're literate, they're charming, very funny, and you will see such attention to detail. Do not overlook anything as you read those books. A crushed out cigarette in the corner, yesterday's newspaper, anything she mentions, it's going to come back around, and it's really quite incredible. She's quite a literate. She's the daughter of 2 literature professors, and she herself is quite literate. You can't believe all the references, but it never escapes the accessibility of a mystery and the kind of comic perils of Pauline sort of nature books. They're really very readable and terrific fun. And she's got a long series of those. I'm not sure exactly how many, 7 or 8, I think, in that series. They're everywhere. It's not hard to find series and to like series. Well, then why not write some? Why not consider your work and where it could go for you? Series could be a prequel as well as a sequel. It could be a spin-off of a popular minor character. It could be a backwards universe variant. All of these things access the power of writing a series. Same background. Your tribe loves it. It's something you can market well to your publisher or to the market itself directly. You can multiply your efficiency from writing another book in a series and really bring your writing to a higher level, I think. Depending on the kind of series that you write, you'll find yourself sharpening and deepening your knowledge of the world setting and really doing yourself a favor. So I'm a big fan of series. I hope you enjoy them too. Thanks a lot for your attention. I think we should probably open it up and see if anybody has questions. These slides are available if you would like to check out. These are all links and so forth, but you can find me on the web, my website there, and my books and narration efforts are also available online. So thanks so much for your attention today. Let's, I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll see if anybody has any questions.
I have a question.
Bernard, go ahead.
All right. First of all, I want to give a shout out to that Edgar Rice Burroughs, John Carter covers. You and I have talked about those during your previous presentation on book covers. So, and those are about 45 years old. So
I did not buy those books until after I had moved out of my mother's house. They are not entirely suitable for your Italian mother to see, but they're terrific. The action in those is just fantastic, and it's a great, well realized world. Yeah, but did you have a question too?
Yeah, no, I do have a question. So you talked about the first and the third were an episodic series and a kitchen sink series. Now,
right.
How do you distinguish between an episodic and kitchen sink series? For example, you said Gilligan's Island was a episodic series, yet the common theme was 7 individuals on a desert island.
Right.
Now,
right.
And maybe I'm answering this myself, but when I look at a Hallmark series Christmas movie, the theme is Christmas, but each of the movies is completely separate versus Gilligan's Island, where it's the same people every episode. So.
Right. And the setting in Gilligan's Island is also identical. Now, in a murder mystery, the setting is not strictly not geographically identical, but it is always the scene of the crime, the detective's office, interrogating the suspect. There's lots of strong similarities between the venues where the mystery is played out. Whereas in the kitchen sink series, again, the theme is similar. So it's always Christmas time. There's always a scene where you're decorating the Christmas tree, right? But it could be small town New England. It could be suburban Midwest. It could be 19th century. It could be 18th century. I mean, massive changes in the setting, particularly. And the characters can also be entirely different. They serve very, very similar roles, right? In a lot of Hallmark movies, she's got the high-powered job, and she's just here in town for a couple of days to set the affairs straight, right? There's no way she's going to stay here, right? And you all know, right? You just take out the mortgage money right now. Of course she's going to stay here when the movie is over. There's no doubt of that. And so there is a big change that happens, which is not the case with an episodic series. The setting stays the same, and Gilligan and his people have the same huts, for however many episodes that series ran. It was, the geography of the island was extremely well known, right?
What about character development in an episodic series? You didn't mention that.
Yeah.
I mean, you made a point that in an episodic series you can read the books out of order, but in reality, though, usually over that series there is some sort of character development and even changes that take place. In the Conan Doyle series with Sherlock Holmes,
Yeah.
you did mention the fact that Watson does get married eventually.
Yeah.
And so that, so to take when you read one book that says, well, here Watson's married, but then you read an earlier book and he's not married, doesn't that
Right.
tend to get a little more confusing in that sense?
I would say, I was just trying to set up sort of what we call the center of the target here, right? Gilligan's Island is right in the bullseye. It's the Robin Hood arrow that splits the other arrow in the center of the bullseye, right? Whereas Sherlock Holmes is maybe in the first ring. It's still an episodic series, but yeah, there's a little nudge. Things do happen a little bit. And, Watson gets married. That's nice. That means that sometimes Sherlock is banging on his door and saying, come on, the game's afoot, instead of them sitting around in Sherlock's living room when he jumps up and says the game's afoot, right? It's not really a huge change. Whereas, Game of Thrones, my God, everybody's dead, right? He just.
You're ruining it.
Oh, sorry. Spoiler alert. Sorry.
It's Sherlock too.
Sherlock. Yeah. That's going to really ruin it for you. But the changes that happen because of the focus on character in a sneaky epic are very different from the basic sameness of an episodic series. Yeah, the little changes. So it's not exactly a perfect episodic series, but it's really close, right? A lot of those mysteries are really close. Yeah, Ms. Slavinsky.
Yeah, hi there.
Hi.
I am, I don't think I was ever going to not write a series.
Okay.
Epic fantasy is kind of everything I've always done since I was like 10.
Yeah.
So I'm just about finishing up my first novel. I'm about the 5th round of edits.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a young adult epic fantasy. My question is this. I see at least the first 5 books, I can probably get her through to her mid-20s.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens when you're writing a series and your character ages out of your genre?
Oh, gosh, I really don't know. How often has that been experimented with, right? Now, you're in an epic fantasy, so the first thing that occurs to me is she could simply have something happen that makes her stop aging. But what does that mean, right? The years are going by, and you'd like to think she's learning stuff, getting better, right? And how could she get better without being older? That's a challenge, right? But I think what's really most interesting is that you seem to have mapped out several stories in a row, and you're not quite sure where it all ends. But if you've mapped out those stories, then you probably have some kind of an idea about where each of those stories ends, and that there is an ending to them, that they're definitely installments of some ongoing tale that has these kind of punctuation points, these beat marks in it, right? And that's very interesting and good. I don't know if you have to know the end at the beginning. I can't speak to that. I don't think a lot of the big authors really did either. Obviously, George R.R. Martin had no idea. So here we are raining on him today. But, I think he'll be okay with $300-400 million. He'll probably survive the scorn of this group today. But yeah, you've got that mapped out, which is really good.
Well, I've got, it started out as one story.
Yeah.
And when I presented my idea to the editor, she goes, oh, no. At least 3 books.
Good.
You got too much going on here.
Good editor. Keep.
Yeah, she's wonderful. She really sees my vision and gives me the kind of feedback I need for my story without overtaking it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I see my current character, Nira, I see this as being probably a 5-book series.
Okay.
But I also, because I've spent the last 10 years creating this world, my favorite part about writing series is the world building. I love that. I just love world building.
Great.
And I can see there's like 100 years ago, there was a big dragon war that changed things forever in this entire archipelago.
Yep.
So I can write a whole series on the dragon war. In my second book, she travels to all these different islands, and each island she goes is a whole separate race of people.
Right.
They have their own, there's like the Valkyrie types, and then the people who live on the water that have never stepped on land. And
right.
like a novel that could come out of each one of those.
Yeah, why not? You've done all this work. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Any advice for things that I really shouldn't do with this as I'm heading off into this area?
No, I have no advice about what not to do. You're the kid in the candy store. This is great, right? You decide whether it's chocolate or suckers today. It's up to you, right? And I think you could also be tooling away on more than one of these projects at once. I mean, the muse might carry you a certain distance, and I think a lot of people do that. They get partway through a story idea, and then they run into a bit of a like, I don't know exactly what's next, and they get all disappointed and stop. And that's crazy. Just put it aside. You'll move to another project, and some people really work well when they're pushing a number of rods at the same time down the hill. That's entirely a question of your working style. Keep the notes. Go wherever the spirit takes you on a given day. You'll be great. I'm not gonna tell you what not to do with that. Sounds fantastic. I just get excited when I hear Archipelago, right? Because we got Earthsea. I love that. That's one of the best books ever written, right? Wizard of Earthsea.
She's my favorite all-time author.
You have not made a bad choice. Excellent choice. Yeah, she's fantastic. And she's written books about writing as well, which I found harder to follow, but she's certainly a guru, was a guru as well as a terrific
I have
author.
somewhere, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Anyone, I'm sorry. Anyway, Ms. Yost, take yourself off mute there.
Hi, so thank you. This was very interesting. I just had a general question. So you said you've written in third and first person. For you personally, what was the biggest difference between the two?
I find that actually third, first, and second, after you make that, it's sort of like shifting gear on a standard stick car, except you've never been taught how to drive standard, So the gears grind. You're like horrified at first, but after 2 or 3 blocks, you start to realize, you know what? The description's all the same. The conversation's exactly the same. You just have to kind of park it at entry and exit points, almost like the doors in and out of a mall. It's not really that often that you make reference to a voice itself, the you, the I, the he. So third person was more appropriate to a captain of men commanding soldiers. I occasionally ducked out of his point of view to show you what the enemy was thinking. I don't think it would have worked to have been first person and jumped out of that. But with Feldspar, in the first person, I stayed with him every step of the way. It had to be that intimate. That's the payoff, right? That you get to see what's going on inside his mind. And Feldspar has worn so many disguises in his life that you find out that it's a little crowded in here. He doesn't really know who he is. So there's enough confusion with that I'm not having to jump to some other point of view. I stayed with him throughout. And actually, the second person voice, once you get over it, it's a terrible gear shift to have to make. But once you get over it, it does lapse into a very intimate point of view, a lot like first. You ought to consider, if you're doing second, whether you'd be better off doing first. I think I had good reasons for staying in second, but then I was a desperate man because that was a really hard book for me to write, and I felt I had to go for it. I liked the idea too. It was just fun. All right.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Sure,
Skylar?
I have a question.
Sure, Skylar.
So I just think with an epic series or a series where chronological order is really important, I just think so much about the time gaps between the books.
Mm-hmm.
And I have all different kinds of ideas, and it's kind of difficult to try to figure out, like, if you're planning a series, how much time should you have in between books? And how much pressure that would put on the first book that you write, because you want to read them in order. And I just feel I've come across series where I just wasn't interested in the rest of the series because the first book just didn't hook me in.
Mm-hmm. So you lose them. Yeah. That's true.
Yeah. So
that can happen. Yeah.
I was just wondering about your advice for being able to, I guess, sort of plan out your series with having a first book and the chronology without confusing your reader so much when they jump into the next book that they kind of have some sort of expectation,
Right.
possibly.
Well, I think that's a fabulous question, and a lot is going to have to depend on the kind of world that you've constructed for yourself. If you're in a world where, I don't know, every 100 years the bad guys come back, pretty much no matter what you do, well then, I think the time between book 1 and book 2 is probably going to be 100 years. That's what you have set up for yourself. In a lot of cases, the time is telescoped in, and you're going day by day or even hour by hour. And when you jump around to different characters, like some books I've done where I'm jumping around, each chapter is with a different character, but they're at very close points of time. The only sin that you can commit is to really commit things out of chronological order. To tell me what Dave did on Friday and then jump to what Mike did the previous Tuesday, that you're taking a real risk when you do that. The reader assumes the march of time. The reader assumes that, unless it's a book about time travel. But even so, the relative time of the character is marching forward, right? A flashback or a flash forward, you have to be very careful about handling those. Otherwise, it's a question of whether the time, like you're talking about, a kind of consistent passage of time. And what I have found is that in my epics, the ones that really have the big stakes, the time kind of telescopes out. And then typically towards the end, it telescopes in. So stuff is happening very rapidly to the various characters, and they run into the plaza from opposite ends and see each other. I mean, literally in real time at the same time, that kind of telescoping. And I think the reader's okay with that. They know they're in good hands if you handle that well, but you do have to know what you're about. And I'm not a guy who loves Excel, but I will create an Excel file with the days of the month down the left side, and then where is Justin, where is Feldspar, where is Wistara, oh, look, he can't possibly be there by then. I better fix that, and you have to keep yourself honest, and or else create teleportation scrolls everywhere, to fix those holes. And the reader will sense that. But I don't think there's really a consistent rule that you have to observe. You make those rules yourself. Like I said about the every 100 years, that's going to pretty much set you in place. But that's not bad. Now it's the great-grandchildren of the heroes of the first book, that are waiting for the challenge to come back. That can be fine. That can be great. It depends on you, your plan for it.
Thank you very much. I never even really thought about the telescoping of time within the book too. All this sequence of events. Yeah.
At the end of the Judgment's Tale novel, I have 4 or 5 clots of people who are hundreds of miles apart, all within the same 18-hour period, having a lot go on. And the chapters got shorter and the action level went up. And I actually had some difficulty. I realized I could shuffle these like a deck of cards. They're happening within minutes of each other. They're not violating the time rule. And I needed to do some better alternation of the venues and what was happening to increase the emotional drama of the story. So I shuffled those literally. There was a 16 set, and I just went, wait, no, there we go. That's the one. And then I had it in order because they were all happening so close in time together. That can happen. It's great to have a word processor. I would not be doing this. Stephen King, he still writes on a yellow legal pad. He just uses a pen on a yellow legal. Of course, he has an intern to type it all up, which is very nice for him. But the word processor is great. Ms. Gillo, did you have a question? I see you there. No, you're cool. You're good. Melissa, I think you're in the dark about something. No, you're just in the dark generally. I don't know. It's our last person on the line. Well, if there are no more questions, then I think we're good to go. And Mr. Schmidt, yes, one more from you.
You know me. I got to get the last word in. Yes, for a very long time.
Yeah.
All right, you've talked about world building in previous presentations, but you kind of glossed over it when you talked about the epic series, number 2.
Mm-hmm.
When you started your series, the first book of your series, how defined was your world when you started? Was it like completely defined in your head to the infinite detail, or was it kind of like it mostly there, and then, or and how much of it was developed as you went along with the series? Like by the time you got to the third book, it's like, oh, I had a really great idea as I was working my way through the series to add
Yeah.
this aspect to the world. So,
Yeah.
like, take your take on that.
I would say for me, well over 90% in terms of development. I had been fooling around with my world setting for 30 years. Maps, notes, character sheets, things of that nature. And so I had a very, very clear sense of how the world was, the cosmology of it, the moons, the seasons, the monsters, the geography, the history. I had a lot of that done. And the characters had to go through it. And there would be little points that I'd get stuck on. And the one I'll tell you briefly, my character Feldspar gets very badly hurt by these 6-foot tall insects halfway through the story. And he was in an abandoned temple. He staggers out of the temple, and a healer, as he's passing out, a healer takes him and fixes him up, saves his life. And he learns from the healer about this new philosophy that really upsets him. He's like not his worldview at all. The healer is very Zen and has a lot of wisdom to impart in his gentle way. And I just stopped cold at that scene because I said, well, I know what these healers are like. I know the kinds of miracles they can perform. I know what their commitment and their philosophy is, but I don't know anything about this guy. And as I looked in my notes and I thought, I was in the habit of thinking about these things as I fall asleep at night in bed. I just think about my story for a few minutes. And then in the morning, I usually remember what I thought. And so it's all kind of trying to fall in place. And suddenly the name comes to me. There was a great healer that I happen to know a ton about. And he had left the sort of view of the rest of the world's heroes about 6 months earlier. And I thought, holy cow, it's him. It's Kama. I know all about him. And I immediately, to my word processor, wrote the entire scene from start to finish. I think it's really good stuff. But that was one of those experiences you sometimes have where you look down at your paper and you start to reread and you go, wow, who wrote this? This is really good. You ought to see this, Somebody came up to my computer and wrote this whole scene. It's like an out-of-body experience. And because I was waiting for that one little thing to drop in place. So that's an example of the little thing that comes along later, but it's pretty small. I just needed the name. And then I was off like a shot. Most of it was pretty well set, and I'm just looking to live long enough to type the rest of it out.
I'd like to respond to Bernard's question as well.
Yeah, sure.
I kind of did the opposite. I started with one character, and I kind of knew her. And one of the things that got me, I, like you, had spent probably 20 years just thinking about the story, wanting to write a story, and it never going anywhere. And I was listening to an audiobook of Ursula Le Guin, and in the intro, she was talking about how she didn't see her, so she was her writing process, and she didn't see herself so much as a writer as much as a historian. So when I started to embrace that, I started with this one character, and I said, okay, I'm just going to write this little bit of her story. For me, the world ended up kind of building out of the world was character driven,
right.
And then it ended up with a life of its own. So
yeah, that's great. And you had the idea that it was going to be a series from an early point, which is terrific. You didn't need to hear any of this. You're all set. Well, okay, everyone. Thank you very much for all this attention, the great questions. Once again, this will be posted to the YouTube site probably tomorrow because it takes forever to download to my computer after we're done. But I've really enjoyed it. I think we have a couple planned for the fall, winter side of the house, and we'll get dates and information to you later. But thanks again for coming. Dorcia, I hand it back to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Will. Once again, I think this has been our best collaborative program, especially at the end here with the questions and answers and everybody's input. And so many, I can tell there are a lot of great upcoming authors, and some of you are already authors, and some of you have not published yet. And this has just been really great and motivational, and I learned something every single time. And I'll never watch Gilligan's Island again with the same eyes. And I'm with your wife on the Hallmark Channel.
Yeah.
I can sit here and just grin like my mother does at all these shows. So keep checking our website, folks. I did put the Bear website on there, but once again, this is all virtual. So we're all sharing. We're going to be having more authors coming on to the virtual calendar. So keep checking that, and your local libraries, web pages, Facebooks, and just the Delaware Libraries website, dlc.lib.de.us. And I know it's kind of a long one,
It
but
is. It's a string. That's a string.
yeah. So keep checking, and we'll have that recording up pretty soon.
Okay.
So thanks again, Will. It was very entertaining. And
Thanks,
I really
everyone.
appreciate you coming on. Thanks
We'll
thanks
Thank you
everyone
so much,
for
Will.
joining.
see
You're
you.
gonna have to
Thank you.
check your books out.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks a lot. Bye now.
Take care.